How did a wedding insult in front of 300 guests end with my own son being removed from my life forever? Why did one sentence whispered by my wife after I cleared the hall change the balance of power in my entire family? This is how I learned that the woman everyone mocked had been choosing me carefully, and quietly, all along. Before we continue, we ask you to hit the hype button, subscribe, and like the video to help the channel grow. Tell us which city you are from in the comments. We would like to get to know our audience better. The morning of my wedding, I stood in front of a mirror in a small tailoring studio on Lexington Avenue and adjusted my tie for the 4th time. The fabric was silk, deep charcoal with subtle threads of silver running through it, but it might as well have been sandpaper against my throat for how uncomfortable I felt. No entourage surrounded me. No groomsmen fussing over champagne flutes or making nervous jokes about cold feet. Just me, a 54-year-old widower about to marry a woman 13 years younger than himself, and the quiet hum of a sewing machine somewhere in the back room where Bernard's assistant was working on alterations for another customer. The tailoring studio smelled of pressed wool and cedar from the wooden hangers lining every wall. Suits hung in neat rows like soldiers waiting for inspection. Morning light filtered through the high windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the worn hardwood floor. Bernard himself, a thin man with silver-rimmed glasses and fingers permanently stained with chalk dust from decades of marking fabric, watched me with something close to pity. "You look fine, Mr. Holden," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an Eastern European accent that decades in New York had not quite erased. "Stop fidgeting." I was not fidgeting because of nerves. Not the usual kind, anyway. I was fidgeting because I knew with absolute certainty what awaited me at that hotel ballroom across town. 300 guests arranged at round tables covered in white linen. My son Asher standing somewhere near the front with that expression of barely concealed contempt he had perfected over the past 2 years. His wife Melina beside him, all sharp angles and sharper tongue. Her family, the Cross family, scattered throughout the room like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. And every single one of them was convinced beyond any shadow of doubt that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My phone buzzed on the marble counter beside the display of cufflinks Bernard kept for customers who forgot their own. I picked it up and read the text from Asher. 300 confirmed. Try not to embarrass yourself. I stared at those words for a long moment, reading them again and again as if repetition might change their meaning. My own son, 28 years old. The boy I had raised alone after his mother Eleanor passed when he was just 11, far too young to understand why she was not coming back from the hospital, too young to process the hollow look in my eyes when I sat him down on his narrow bed and tried to explain that some things could not be fixed, no matter how much you wanted them to be. The young man I had put through private school when I could barely afford the tuition, working 14-hour days to make sure he never felt poor, never felt lacking, never felt like anything less than the child of privilege he deserved to be. The heir to everything I had built over 30 years in commercial real estate, every building purchased, every deal negotiated, every sleepless night justified by the knowledge that someday it would all belong to him. And he could not send me a single kind word on my wedding day. I put the phone in my pocket without responding and looked at myself in the mirror again. The same face I had been staring at for 54 years stared back. Gray at the temples now, spreading slowly inward like frost creeping across a window pane. Lines around my eyes that had not been there a decade ago, some from laughter, more from worry. A body that had thickened with age despite my efforts to maintain the trim figure of my youth, though it still held itself straight, still moved with the deliberate purpose of a man who knew where he was going, even when he was not entirely sure why. I had never been handsome, not really. Not in the way magazine covers or movie screens defined the word, but I had always been steady, reliable, the kind of man people underestimated until it was too late, until the deal was signed, the building was sold, the competitor was wondering how they had missed what was happening right in front of them. Celine had seen that quality in me. She had seen it from the very first moment we met, at a charity auction 14 months ago when the autumn leaves were just beginning to turn and the city was caught, in that brief golden period between summer's oppressive heat and winter's bitter cold. She had been standing alone near the back of the crowded room, away from the clusters of socialites and businessmen bidding on things they did not need, and I had walked over to introduce myself for no reason other than that she looked like someone who wanted to leave. We talked for 2 hours that night while the auction continued without us. Then 3 hours the next week at a quiet restaurant in the village. Then dinner became walks through Central Park, the leaves crunching beneath our feet as we discussed everything from philosophy to our favorite childhood memories. The walks became quiet evenings in my apartment, where she cooked elaborate meals from recipes she had learned traveling through Europe, and I sat at the kitchen counter and listened to her talk about places she had visited and books she had read, and the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw what they expected to see. She never talked about money, not once, never asked about my business or expressed curiosity about the numbers involved in what I did for a living, never seemed impressed by the things that impressed everyone else, the penthouse apartments, the vacation homes, the networking events where everyone was performing their success for each other. She just wanted to know about me, about my past, about what I hoped for and what I feared and what I dreamed about when I was not dreaming about anything at all. And when I proposed, 6 months later on a gray November evening with rain streaking the windows and nothing at all romantic about the setting, she said yes with tears in her eyes and a smile that made me feel like I was 25 again. Like every mistake I had ever made was forgiven. Like every loss I had ever suffered was finally being balanced by something wonderful. That was the woman I was marrying today. The woman my son Asher called the replacement when he thought I was not paying attention. The woman his wife Melina referred to as that creature in conversations with her parents that I was not supposed to overhear. The woman the entire Cross family had decided, without ever speaking to her for more than 5 minutes, was a gold digger looking to steal my fortune and leave me with nothing. I finished adjusting my tie for the 5th time and turned to thank Bernard for his patience. He shook my hand with both of his, pressing firmly in a way that conveyed more than words could. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, "remember who you are. You have survived worse." I drove myself to our apartment on the Upper West Side, a modest 2-bedroom in a building without doormen or marble lobbies, the kind of place that made people raise their eyebrows when they heard where I lived. Celine had insisted on it when we moved in together 8 months ago. She could have asked for anything. A penthouse overlooking the park, a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, a house in the Hamptons with staff and tennis courts and all the trappings of the wealth she assumed I would want to display. But she wanted this. A kitchen with good morning light where she could grow herbs on the windowsill. A bedroom with a view of the treetops in the small park across the street. A life that felt normal, quiet, authentic, stripped of pretension and performance. She was waiting for me when I arrived, already dressed in a simple cream gown that fell to the floor in soft waves, giving her the look of a Renaissance painting. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant twist that revealed the graceful line of her neck. Her eyes, those remarkable eyes that shifted from gray to green depending on the light, were calm and clear. "You look worried," she said, stepping forward to straighten my lapels even though they were already perfect. "I'm not worried. Elias." She placed her hands flat against my chest. "I know your family doesn't approve. I know today will be difficult. I know the Cross family sees this wedding as an opportunity for entertainment." She said the word with quiet distaste. "But I want you to know something before we walk into that ballroom." "What?" "I chose you, not your money, not your name, not your buildings or your connections. Just you." She rose on her toes and kissed my forehead, so gently it made my chest ache. "Exactly you." I kissed her in return and held her close, breathing in the light floral scent of her perfume, feeling the warmth of her body. Outside the window, the city moved on. Traffic, pedestrians, the constant hum of millions of lives intersecting, and none of it cared about weddings or families or the small cruelties committed in the name of love. "We should go," I said. She nodded and picked up her small clutch from the counter. No diamonds. No flashy jewelry, just a simple gold bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother, the only piece of her past she ever wore. As we walked down the 3 flights of stairs, our building had no elevator, another detail that baffled my son. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Asher. "Melina's parents are already there. Try to be gracious." I didn't respond. I unlocked our modest sedan, held the door for my bride, and drove through the crowded streets toward whatever awaited us at the hotel. The ballroom was enormous. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with clouds and angels. White tablecloths covered round tables arranged around a polished dance floor. Flowers spilled from every surface. Roses, lilies, orchids. Arrangements that must have cost more than most people earned in a month. String music drifted from a quartet near the windows. It was the kind of reception that cost 6 figures and took months to plan. Every detail, every glass, every napkin, every note of music had been arranged by Ronan Cross, Melina's father, who insisted on hosting it as a gift. I hadn't wanted this. I'd asked for something small, intimate, a courthouse ceremony and dinner at the Italian place Celine and I loved. But Asher pushed. Melina pushed harder. And eventually I agreed. Not because I wanted it, but because I was tired of fighting, and because a foolish part of me still hoped my son might come around. That was my first mistake, but far from my last. The ballroom was already full when we arrived, fashionably late by 15 minutes because Celine had insisted we pause in the car to breathe and remember that whatever happened inside, we would face it together. 300 guests sat at round tables draped in white linen, champagne glasses catching the light from massive chandeliers, conversations rising and falling like waves. I recognized some faces, old business associates, distant relatives I hadn't spoken to since Eleanor's funeral, people who had faded from my life over time. Others I didn't recognize at all. Friends of the Cross family, invited to fill the room and witness whatever was coming. The Cross family had invited half the city, it seemed. Anyone with money, influence, or social standing had received one of those thick cream invitations with gold embossing that Melina had shown me months earlier. "This is how it is done," she had said, smiling in that way that always made me feel as if I were failing a test I hadn't known existed. "This is how you announce yourself." Ronan Cross stood near the entrance, greeting guests as if he owned the place, which in his mind he did. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried his 60 years with the aggressive energy of a man who refused to admit time was passing. His booming voice filled the marble foyer as he shook hands, slapped backs, and accepted congratulations as though this were his victory, his moment. His wife Margot hovered beside him, thin and carefully preserved, her eyes never fully settling on anyone she spoke to. She laughed at everything Ronan said, a sharp tinkling sound that reminded me of breaking glass, agreed with every opinion, and radiated the quiet emptiness of someone who had spent decades defining herself through another person. When Ronan saw us approach through the crowd, his smile did not falter. Not exactly, but something in his eyes shifted, a glint of amusement, of anticipation, of something that looked almost like hunger. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment and is pleased to see it finally arriving. "Elias!" He clasped my hand in both of his, gripping with just slightly more force than necessary, just enough pressure to remind me who was in control here. The man of the hour, the groom himself. He released my hand and turned his attention to Celine, letting his gaze travel slowly, deliberately, from her understated shoes to her simple gown to her unadorned face. "And this must be the lucky lady." "Celine," she said, extending her hand with perfect composure. "It is wonderful to finally meet you properly, Mr. Cross. Elias has told me so much about your family." He shook her hand briefly. Too briefly, really, almost dismissively, and turned back to me with an expression I could not quite read. "She is quite something, Elias. Quite something indeed." The words were complimentary on the surface, but beneath them lurked something else, something that sounded like mockery pretending to be praise. I did not like his tone. I did not like the way he looked at my wife. I did not like any of this. The venue, the guest list, the champagne towers and ice sculptures, and everything else that screamed excess while pretending to celebrate love. But I smiled and moved past him into the ballroom because that was what you did in situations like this. You smiled, you nodded, you pretended not to notice the daggers hiding in people's words, the contempt lurking beneath their courtesies. The ceremony itself had been brief and beautiful. A civil proceeding at the courthouse earlier that morning, just the two of us and a judge named Patricia, who seemed genuinely delighted to marry two people who actually wanted to be married. No family, no witnesses except the court clerks. Just Celine and me exchanging vows in a small room with tall windows and worn wooden benches and the particular echoing quiet of official spaces. This reception was something else entirely. This was the performance, the public spectacle, the part where everyone watched and judged and decided what kind of man I really was for marrying a woman they had already condemned without trial. We found our table at the front of the room, positioned prominently so that every guest could observe us clearly, so that nothing we did or said or wore would escape notice. Asher was already seated there with Melina, both of them dressed like they were attending a gala at the Metropolitan Museum rather than their father's second wedding. Asher wore a charcoal suit that probably cost $3,000, his dark hair slicked back, his jaw set in that particular way that meant he was uncomfortable and determined not to show it. He had his mother's eyes, sharp and intelligent, capable of seeing through pretense, but over the years he had developed his father's stubbornness without any of my corresponding patience. And Melina? She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished to a high shine, perfect in every detail. And somehow, underneath all that perfection, completely empty of anything that mattered. Her blonde hair fell in precisely arranged waves. Her makeup was flawless. Her designer dress probably cost more than our apartment's annual rent. But when she smiled at me as we approached the table, there was nothing behind it. Nothing warm, nothing kind, just teeth. "Father," Asher said as I sat down. He did not stand, did not shake my hand, did not offer any of the courtesies that tradition and basic respect demanded. Just nodded once, briefly, as if acknowledging a stranger on the street. Asher, Melina. I kept my voice neutral, pleasant, giving them nothing to react against. Melina's smile widened slightly, though perhaps widened was not quite the right word. Sharpened might have been more accurate. Elias, your bride looks comfortable. Celine said nothing. She simply sat beside me and placed her hand on my arm, a gesture of support so subtle that anyone watching might have missed it, but I felt it like an anchor holding me steady in rough waters. The toasts began shortly after the main course was served, some kind of elaborate fish preparation that I barely tasted, followed by beef that might as well have been cardboard for all the attention I paid it. Ronan Cross rose from his seat first, as I had known he would. He positioned himself at the microphone stand that had been placed near the dance floor, champagne glass in hand, that predatory grin still firmly fixed on his face. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room, silencing conversations, drawing every eye to where he stood. We are gathered here this beautiful evening to celebrate a union, a joining of two people who have found each other. Later in life, shall we say? He paused for effect, letting the implication sink in. Some might even say very late. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not everyone laughed. I saw confused expressions here and there, people uncertain whether they were supposed to find this funny. But enough did. Enough to make the message clear. Elias Holden is a man of many accomplishments, Ronan continued, warming to his subject. He was good at this, I realized. Good at making cruelty sound like affection, making insults sound like jokes. Buildings raised and sold, investments placed and multiplied. A son who has made him proud in every way. He gestured toward Asher, who raised his glass with a smile that looked almost genuine. And now, at the ripe age of 54, after years of what we might charitably call bachelorhood, he has found love again. Another pause, another shift in his expression, subtle enough to miss if you were not watching closely, obvious enough to wound if you were. With a woman who... He pretended to search for exactly the right words, enjoying the moment, savoring it. Well, who clearly knows a good opportunity when she sees one. More laughter, louder this time, and scattered throughout the room I could see the reactions he was hoping for, the smirks and raised eyebrows, the knowing glances exchanged between people who had already made up their minds about Celine without ever speaking to her. To Elias and his lovely bride, Ronan concluded, raising his glass high, may they find all the happiness that they deserve. The crowd drank, and I sat motionless in my chair, feeling Celine's hand tighten slightly on my arm, watching the man who had just publicly humiliated us accept congratulations from nearby guests as if he had done something clever rather than cruel. Melina went next. She had insisted on giving a toast at the planning meetings I had mostly avoided, and no one, not Asher, not the wedding coordinator, not even her own mother, had been able to talk her out of it. Now she stood at that same microphone, smoothing her dress with one manicured hand, her expression a perfect mask of innocence that fooled no one who knew her. When I first heard about my father-in-law's engagement, she said sweetly, her voice carrying with practiced precision, I have to admit, I was surprised. She let the word hang in the air for a moment. Elias has always been so careful, so calculated in everything he does. Every investment researched, every risk measured, so I asked myself, what could possibly attract a man like that to someone like... her? She turned to look directly at Celine with an expression of theatrical curiosity, the kind of expression that pretends not to understand what it very clearly understands. Was it her brilliant career? No, I checked, and there does not seem to be one of those. A few chuckles from the crowd. Was it her extensive family connections? Certainly not. No one seems to know who her people are or where they come from. More laughter, louder now. Was it her sparkling wit and charm, her dazzling personality, her remarkable accomplishments? She paused for maximum effect, then released that tinkling laugh of hers, the one that sounded like broken glass falling on marble. Well, I suppose some mysteries are simply better left unsolved, some questions are best not asked, and some marriages are best not examined too closely. The crowd tittered more openly now, losing whatever restraint had held them back before. Phones rose into the air throughout the ballroom. People were recording this, recording my humiliation, my wife's humiliation, preparing to share it with friends and followers and strangers on the internet who would never know any of us but would enjoy the spectacle regardless. I started to stand, some instinct finally overriding the careful control I had maintained all evening. But Celine's hand tightened on my arm, not urgently, not desperately, just firmly. A clear signal. Not yet, she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the ambient noise. Not yet. So I sat, and I watched. And I listened to my son's wife finish her toast with more veiled insults and cruel implications. and I felt something cold and hard and absolute settle into my chest, something that had been sleeping for years, waiting for exactly this moment to wake. After the toasts, the reception shifted to the outdoor terrace for cocktails and what the schedule called mingling. The evening was warm even for August, the city glowing beneath us 40 floors above the street. Manhattan stretched in every direction, the dark green of the park to the north, the canyon of Midtown to the south, bridges and boroughs beyond. Under other circumstances, I might have appreciated the view, but Ronan Cross wasn't finished with me. He cornered me near the railing while Celine spoke with a waiter about a dietary issue, approaching from behind so I didn't notice him until he was already there. His drink, whiskey, expensive by the smell, sloshed slightly as he leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. "You know, Elias," he said quietly, "when my daughter married your son, I thought you were a man with potential, someone who understood appearances, connections, how the world works." He gestured with his glass toward Celine, now standing alone, looking out at the lights. "But this little adventure of yours is disappointing." I said nothing. "That woman is using you," he continued, his tone sliding into pity. "Everyone can see it. Everyone except you. She saw a wealthy widower with no defenses and went for the easy score. When she's taken whatever your prenup missed, she'll leave you with nothing." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "I've seen it 100 times. Women like her are all the same." I turned and looked at him closely for the first time, at the custom suit failing to hide the softness beneath, the gold watch demanding attention, the absolute certainty that money had made him wise. "Are you finished?" I asked. "For now," he said. Friendly advice. Father to father. He walked back to his circle of admirers. I remained at the railing, watching the city pulse below, thinking of all the years I'd spent being reasonable, patient, absorbing insults and telling myself that success was the best revenge. What exactly had that gotten me? Inside the ballroom, the music had started again. People were dancing now, laughing, pretending that nothing unusual had happened, that the toasts had been nothing more than harmless fun between family members who cared about each other. The band was playing something upbeat and forgettable, and the dance floor was crowded with couples moving through motions that passed for celebration. I could not pretend anymore. I excused myself from the terrace and walked down a long corridor toward the restrooms, away from the noise and the judgment and the 100 small humiliations I had allowed myself to absorb. The music faded behind me with each step, replaced by the sterile hum of air conditioning and the soft click of my polished shoes on marble floors. The men's room was empty, a relief. I stood at one of the sinks and stared at my reflection in the mirror above it. The same face I had been looking at for 54 years stared back at me. The same eyes that had watched my first wife Eleanor waste away from the illness that took her at 39. The same hands that had built a business from almost nothing. A single property purchased with borrowed money and converted into an empire through decades of careful, patient work. The same shoulders that had carried my son through childhood and adolescence and into the ungrateful adulthood he now inhabited. This was the man I was, the one who endured, the one who survived, the one who let other people have their say while he quietly went about his business, trusting that time would prove him right even when the moment proved him mocked. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something fundamental had shifted inside me. Some load-bearing wall in the architecture of my patience had finally cracked, and I could feel the whole structure threatening to come down. I thought about years of being careful, being diplomatic, being the reasonable one in every conflict, the peacemaker in every dispute, the adult in every room full of children dressed as grown-ups. I had always believed that dignity was its own reward, that success would speak louder than any defense I could offer, that money and stability and a good reputation were worth more than any temporary satisfaction of putting someone in their place. But what had that belief actually gotten me? A son who treated me like an embarrassment to be managed rather than a father to be respected. A daughter-in-law who mocked my wife in public and faced no consequences whatsoever. A family of vultures who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, a source of inheritance to be secured, a fool whose only value was the money they expected to eventually receive. I dried my hands on one of the small linen towels stacked beside the sink. I straightened my tie, which had drifted slightly askew during the past hour. And when I looked at myself in the mirror again, something had changed in my eyes. Something subtle but unmistakable. Not anger, not rage. Nothing so uncontrolled as that. Something quieter and far more dangerous. Resolution. I walked back through the corridor, past the uniformed waiters carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, past the coat check station manned by a bored young woman scrolling through her phone, past the velvet ropes that separated the VIP areas from the public spaces. Near the rear service entrance, I found the person I was looking for. Evan Holt was the wedding coordinator, a tall, angular man in his late 40s with prematurely silver hair and the exhausted patience of someone who had spent decades managing other people's expectations. He had handled hundreds of events at this hotel, and I suspected he had seen every variety of disaster that humans could inflict on each other while pretending to celebrate. "Mr. Holden," he said, clearly surprised to see the groom wandering through the service areas. "Is everything all right? Can I help you with something?" "I need to speak with Samuel Price," I said, "the venue owner, immediately." Evan's expression shifted slightly, concern replacing surprise. "Mr. Price is in his office reviewing some matters. Is there a problem with the event?" "Not yet," I said. He hesitated for only a moment, then nodded and led me through a maze of back hallways I had never known existed, past prep kitchens where sous chefs worked in focused silence, past storage rooms stacked with extra chairs and table linens, past doors marked staff only and authorized personnel in stern block letters. Finally, we reached a door labeled Simply Private in polished brass. Evan knocked twice. A voice called for us to enter. Samuel Price was sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk covered with papers and folders, and the detritus of ongoing business concerns. He was an older man, perhaps 65, with a round, pleasant face and the cautiously neutral expression of someone who had learned through long experience to navigate the complicated politics of wealth and status without alienating anyone who might become important later. His office was lined with photographs of famous guests and notable events. Celebrities, politicians, business titans, all smiling beside Samuel in front of the hotel's distinctive lobby. "Mr. Holden," he said, rising quickly from his leather chair, "I trust you are enjoying the reception. Is there anything I can do to make the evening more comfortable?" "I have a question," I said. "Of course. Anything at all. This venue, the contracts, the deposits, the binding agreements that make this event possible." I kept my voice level, almost conversational, but something in my tone made both men straighten slightly. "Who signed them?" Samuel blinked, clearly not expecting this particular line of inquiry. "Well, Mr. Cross made the initial arrangements, as you know. His assistant handled most of the coordination. The deposits came from his accounts. But who signed the primary contract?" I pressed gently. "Whose name appears on the legally binding agreement between the hotel and the client?" He shuffled through some papers on his desk, then opened a drawer and extracted a manila folder that he examined with growing confusion. "According to our records, you did, sir. Your signature is on the final documents. Mr. Cross handled the deposits and made most of the arrangements, but the legal contract, the binding agreement that governs the event, is in your name." I nodded slowly, feeling pieces fall into place. "Then I am the client." "Technically, yes, the contract clearly identifies—" "Not technically, Mr. Price. Actually, I am the actual client for this event, which means I have certain rights regarding what happens here tonight." Samuel's expression shifted from confusion to concern to something approaching alarm as he began to understand where this might be heading. He glanced at Evan, who looked equally uncertain. "Mr. Holden, if there is something wrong with the service, I can assure you that we take all complaints extremely. I need you to arrange for security personnel at the main ballroom doors. Quietly, without drawing attention. I also need access to the venue's microphone system, the wireless one that has been used for the toasts." I met his eyes steadily. "And I need you to understand that what happens in the next hour is my decision, not Mr. Cross's, not my son's, mine and mine alone." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant, muffled thumping of the band and the soft whir of the building's climate control. Then Samuel Price picked up his phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession. Brief conversations, conducted in the clipped professional language of someone who knew how to give instructions without explaining them. When he finished, he set down the phone and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Security will be in position within 5 minutes. The microphone will be brought to you whenever you signal for it. And Mr. Holden?" He paused. "Whatever you're planning. I hope you know what you are doing." "So do I said. And I walked back toward the ballroom. By the time I returned to the reception, everything was ready. 4 security guards, large men in dark suits with earpieces and the alert posture of professionals, had taken positions near the main exits. Subtle, unobtrusive. Most guests likely assumed they'd been there all along. The sound technician had prepared the wireless microphone and handed it to a waiter, ready to bring it to me the moment I raised my hand. The band kept playing. People kept dancing and drinking, still pretending this was an ordinary celebration rather than a carefully staged display of contempt. Somewhere in the crowd, Celine was watching me with those calm, knowing eyes that had first drawn me to her at that charity auction so long ago. She stood near the far windows, alone, her cream gown catching the chandelier light, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand. She didn't know what I was planning, couldn't know, but her expression told me she sensed the change in me, the resolve that had settled in my bones. And she trusted me. That trust gave me strength. I had spent my adult life waiting for the right moment, calculating risks, measuring consequences, being reasonable while others behaved badly and faced none. I believed good men didn't make scenes, didn't create drama, didn't lower themselves. But tonight, I was done waiting. Tonight, those rules no longer applied. Ronan Cross was holding court near the dance floor, surrounded by admirers who laughed at every joke and echoed every opinion. His wife Margot sat beside him, nodding along with her fixed smile. Melina sat on his other side, phone in hand, likely posting photos to remind the world how flawless her life was, and how regrettable her father-in-law's choices had been. And Asher, my son, my only child, stood nearby with a drink, wearing an expression of complete boredom, as if this entire night were nothing more than an inconvenience to endure. I walked toward them, slowly, deliberately, making no effort to conceal my approach, but drawing no attention to it either. Just a man moving through a crowded room, weaving between tables and dancers and servers with trays of champagne. When I was close enough to be heard above the music without shouting, I stopped and raised my hand. The waiter appeared at my side instantly, as if he had been waiting for exactly this signal. He placed the wireless microphone in my palm with a small nod, then disappeared back into the crowd. I turned it on, waited for the familiar pop of amplification connecting, and then I spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," my voice carried across the ballroom's premium sound system, slicing through the music, the chatter, and the easy assumptions of everyone present. The band stopped in the middle of a song. Conversations fell silent mid-sentence. 300 faces turned toward me. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This has been an educational evening." A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd. People glanced at each other, uncertain, trying to gauge from their neighbors' expressions how they should react to this unexpected development. I have listened to the toasts offered in my honor and my wife's honor. I have heard the jokes, some subtle, some less so. I have watched my wife be insulted, mocked, and dismissed in front of everyone she was supposed to be welcomed by. I paused, letting the words settle like stones dropping into still water. And I have made a decision. The silence now was absolute. Even the waiters had stopped moving. This reception is over. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. 300 people holding champagne glasses and wearing their finest clothes stood frozen in place, unable to process what they had just heard. It was as if time itself had stopped, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the murmuring began. Low at first, uncertain, spreading through the crowd like ripples from a stone thrown into water. I waited for it to reach its peak before continuing. "If you came here tonight to genuinely celebrate our marriage, to wish us well, to offer your honest congratulations, to share in a moment of happiness, then I thank you sincerely." I turned slowly, letting my gaze sweep across the room, meeting eyes where I could, reading expressions, noting allegiances. "You may leave with my gratitude and my best wishes." Another pause, another moment to let meaning sink in. "But if you came here to mock us, to laugh at us, to treat my wife like something less than human because you decided before meeting her that she was unworthy of respect." My voice never rose above its conversational volume, but something in it made people lean away slightly, as if from heat. "Then your presence is no longer welcome in this room, and you will leave now." I handed the microphone back to the waiter, who took it with slightly trembling hands. On cue, the ballroom's main doors opened. 4 men in dark suits entered and positioned themselves around the room, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the unmistakable presence of professionals prepared to enforce whatever decision had been made. For a stretched, thin moment, no one moved. The silence was so complete I could hear the distant hum of the city far below, the pulse of traffic and life continuing unaware of this small drama playing out in my life. Then, slowly, hesitantly, people began to stand from their tables. Some looked relieved, grateful perhaps to have permission to leave an event that had grown increasingly uncomfortable. Others looked merely confused, uncertain whether they had somehow missed something important. And a few, mostly concentrated at and near the table where the Cross family sat, looked genuinely outraged, but they all moved toward the exits. What else could they do? Melina was the first of my son's new family to voice her objection. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped harshly against the polished floor, the sound cutting through the murmured confusion like a knife. "This is completely insane," she said, loud enough for everyone still in the room to hear. "You cannot simply throw people out of their own party. My father arranged all of this. He paid for everything." "No," I said calmly. "He paid for the flowers and the food and the music. The party itself, the legally binding agreement with this venue for this date and this event, that contract has my name on it. Only my name." I met her eyes steadily, without hostility, but without warmth either. "This was never your party, Melina. It was never your father's party. He simply decorated." Her face went pale, then flushed with anger. "You cannot—" "I can. I have. And now you and your family will leave, or security will escort you out." Ronan Cross pushed himself up from his seat, his face purple with barely contained rage. He looked like a man who had just had the ground shift beneath his feet without warning, unable to understand how he had lost control of a situation he had been so certain he dominated. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded, moving toward me. "Do you have any idea what I can do to you? The connections I have? The influence I wield in this city?" I looked at him the way I might look at a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store, with patience, with mild disappointment, with absolutely no fear whatsoever. "You are a man who mistakes volume for authority," I said quietly, "who confuses money with power and status with respect. You are a man who believes that mocking others makes him strong, when in fact it only reveals his weakness." I took a single step toward him. "And you are leaving now." For a dreadful moment, I thought he might lash out. His hands curled tightly at his sides. His jaw locked so hard I could see the muscles twitch beneath his skin. Something dark and dangerous flashed in his expression. But then he looked around, saw the security guards watching, ready to intervene, saw his wife, Margot, standing beside him with an expression of poorly concealed terror, saw the remaining guests carefully not watching, giving him the space to make whatever choice he was going to make, and he realized that any physical action would only make things worse, would only prove everything I had just said about him. "This is not over," he hissed, low enough that only I and those immediately nearby could hear. "Not by a long way." "Yes," I replied calmly. "It is." He turned and walked toward the exit, Margot scurrying behind him like a nervous attendant, her heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor. Melina followed after one last venomous look over her shoulder, a look that promised consequences, retribution, accounting yet to come. Good. Let her look. Let them all look and remember this moment. And then there was just Asher. My son stood alone in the rapidly emptying ballroom, surrounded by abandoned champagne glasses and plates of half-eaten food and overturned chairs that guests had not bothered to right in their haste to leave. He looked, in that moment, very small, very young, like the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders through Central Park, pointing out birds and clouds and every small wonder the world had to offer. But he was not that boy anymore, had not been for years. "Father," he said quietly as I approached. His voice had lost its usual confident edge. "You did not have to do this." "No," I agreed. "I did not have to. This was a choice. My choice." "Why?" I stepped close enough that only he could hear what I said next, a private moment in what had been a very public evening. "Because you had a choice too, Asher. All evening. You could have defended your stepmother when Melina attacked her. You could have asked your father-in-law to show basic human decency. You could have stood up and said, 'That is enough,' the first time someone crossed a line." I put my hand on his shoulder, a gesture I had made 10,000 times throughout his life, offering comfort, offering guidance, offering connection. "You could have been my son tonight instead of their puppet, but you chose them, and now you have to live with that choice." I removed my hand and walked toward the private exit where Celine was waiting. The ballroom doors closed behind me with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The car was waiting at the rear valet entrance, a black sedan with tinted windows, driven by a man whose name I did not know. Not one of the regular drivers who occasionally shuttled Celine and me to events we could not easily reach by subway. Someone new, someone she had apparently arranged. She was already inside when I slid into the cool leather seat and pulled the door closed behind me. Her face was calm in the dim interior lighting, her expression unreadable as always, but something in the way she looked at me suggested she was seeing me differently now, as if some theory she had formed about my character had just been confirmed. The driver pulled away without a word, and the hotel disappeared behind us, that massive building full of crystal chandeliers and expensive judgments becoming just another unremarkable structure in the endless parade of Manhattan architecture. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The city slid past the tinted windows like a river of light and motion, storefronts and street lamps and pedestrians going about their ordinary lives, unaware that a minor earthquake had just occurred 40 floors above them. People walked dogs and carried groceries and checked their phones and did all the mundane things people do on warm summer evenings. None of them knew or cared about weddings or families or the carefully targeted cruelties that humans inflict on each other in the name of love. "I am sorry," I finally said. The silence had become too heavy to carry any further. "That was not the wedding you deserved." Celine turned to look at me fully. Her eyes caught the shifting lights from outside, gray becoming green, then gray again, like quiet water reflecting an uncertain sky. "You stopped it," she said. "Too late. They had already said what they wanted to say, already recorded it and probably posted it online." "No." She reached across the leather seat between us and took my hand in hers. Her skin was warm against mine, her fingers strong and gentle at once. "You stopped it at exactly the right moment. The moment when silence would have become consent, the moment when endurance would have become complicity." She squeezed gently. "That is why I chose you, Elias. That is exactly why." I looked down at our intertwined fingers, struck suddenly by how right they looked together. Her hand pale and smooth against mine, darker and roughened by decades of work that included more manual labor than people expected from a man in my position. Perfect opposites. Perfect complement. "What do you mean, chose me?" She was quiet for a moment, as if selecting her words with unusual care, weighing each one, testing its weight and shape before releasing it into the air between us. "When we first met, at that charity auction, standing in the back of that crowded room while everyone else bid on things they did not need and congratulated themselves on their generosity." She smiled slightly at the memory. "I had been looking for someone, Elias, for a very long time. Not a husband, necessarily. Not a partner in the conventional sense. Just someone who understood." "Understood what?" "That power has nothing to do with noise. That strength does not require performance. That the most dangerous people in any room are the quiet ones who see everything and react to nothing." She shifted slightly, turning to face me more fully. "You approached me that night because I looked like someone who wanted to leave, not because you wanted anything from me, not because you saw an opportunity, just because you saw me." I remembered that night, the crowded auction hall with its 2 bright lights and 2 loud conversations, the endless parade of wealthy people performing their wealth for each other, and Celine standing alone near an emergency exit, watching everything with an expression I could not quite read. "I thought I was just being friendly," I said. "You were. That was exactly the point." She released my hand and leaned back against the leather seat. "Most men who approach women at events like that want something. They want to impress, to acquire, to demonstrate their value. But you just wanted to talk. You asked questions and actually listened to my answers. You never mentioned your business, never dropped names, never tried to establish your importance in the social hierarchy we were both pretending to participate in." "I have never been good at that kind of thing," she laughed, a soft, genuine sound. "You are the most interesting man I have ever met, precisely because you are completely uninterested in proving it to anyone else." The car turned onto a quieter street. Trees lined both sides, their leaves rustling in the warm evening breeze. Streetlights cast pools of amber on the pavement, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. "There is something I need to tell you," Celine said. Her voice had shifted slightly, still calm, but with an undertone I had never heard before. Something like apprehension, or anticipation, or both. Something I should have explained before tonight, but I needed to be certain first. Certain of what? That you loved me for myself, for exactly who I am when everything else is stripped away. She met my eyes directly. Not for anything else I might have to offer. A cold sensation began to creep up my spine, not fear, exactly. More like the awareness that something significant was about to change, that the ground I had been standing on was about to shift in ways I could not predict. "Celine, what are you talking about?" She took a deep breath. "The apartment we live in. The simple life we have built together. The way I never talk about money or family background or where I came from before." She paused. "That was all deliberate, Elias. All of it. Every aspect of how I presented myself to you was carefully designed." "Designed for what?" "To find out if you were real." Her voice was very quiet now. "To discover whether you could love someone you believed had nothing to offer except herself." I stared at her in the dim light of the moving car. The words she had just spoken echoed in my mind, rearranging themselves, taking on new meanings with each repetition. "You have been testing me," I said slowly, "this entire time." Not testing. She shook her head firmly. Searching. Looking for someone who could see past the things that do not matter. Someone who would choose me, the actual person I am, rather than what I represent. What you represent? Another breath. Another moment of hesitation before the plunge. I am wealthy, Elias, extremely wealthy. The kind of wealth that comes from generations of careful accumulation rather than any single success of my own. She spoke the words precisely, without pride or boasting, just stating facts. My family built one of the largest shipping conglomerates in Northern Europe 3 generations ago. Container ships, port facilities, logistics networks spanning 4 continents. When my parents passed away 5 years ago, I inherited everything. All of it, every asset, every holding, every quietly multiplying investment. I sat in stunned silence. The words made no sense. They did not match the woman I had been living with for nearly a year. The woman who cooked our dinners from scratch and washed our dishes by hand and insisted on taking the subway rather than calling a car service. You are rich, I heard myself say, the word coming out flat and strange. The word rich does not quite capture it, she said quietly. The technical estimates, the last time my advisors calculated them, put my net worth somewhere in the vicinity of $700 million, though it fluctuates, as these things do. $700 million. The number hung in the air between us like something physical, too large to quite comprehend, too absurd to easily accept. Why did you hide it? My voice sounded strange in my own ears. Why live like we have been living? Why pretend to be ordinary? She completed my thought. Because I have been married before. Twice. Both times to men who were charming and attentive and absolutely convinced they loved me. Her voice took on an edge of old pain. And both times, when the initial romance faded and daily life set in, they revealed that what they actually loved was what I represented. The money, the access, the lifestyle. When I was no longer a prize to be won, when I became just a person requiring actual partnership, they both found reasons to leave. One took considerable assets with him. The other tried to take even more. Understanding began to dawn. You hid your wealth because I swore to myself that if I ever married again, it would be to someone who had absolutely no idea, she finished. Someone who chose me when I appeared to have nothing particular to offer. Someone who would love me in a 2-bedroom apartment just as easily as in a mansion. She reached out and took my hand again. Someone exactly like you. The car continued through the quiet streets. The city passed by unchanged, indifferent to revelations that were reshaping my understanding of everything. Does anyone else know? I asked finally. About who you really are? My attorneys, my asset managers, a few friends from my previous life in Europe, and now you. She paused. Just you, of everyone in my current life. The Cross family's insults about money were amusing, in a way. They were so absolutely certain they understood the situation. That I was after your money, your status, your holdings. A small, cold smile appeared on her lips. They had no idea that I could buy and sell their entire operation, including their house and their business, and every asset they pretend makes them important. I sat with this information for a long moment, trying to integrate it with everything I thought I knew. It should have felt like a betrayal, like a lie told too long, like a manipulation that tainted everything we had built together, but instead, it felt like a gift. Like proof of something I had always believed but never been able to prove. You trusted me, I said. I trusted you from the first moment you approached me at that auction. Her voice was fierce and tender at once. I just needed to be absolutely certain that you would keep being yourself once you knew, that the wealth would not change you the way it changed everyone else. And now? Her smile changed, warming, softening, becoming the smile I'd fallen in love with all those months ago. Now, she said quietly, I have some phone calls to make. We arrived at our modest apartment, and Celine went immediately to the small desk in the corner of the living room where she kept her laptop. Within seconds, she had it open, had logged into something requiring multiple layers of security verification, and was typing with a speed and focus I had never seen from her before. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes, leaning against the counter, trying to process everything that had happened in the space of a single evening. 2 hours ago, I had been a widower, marrying a woman everyone thought was beneath him. Now, I was a widower married to one of the wealthiest individuals in the Western Hemisphere, a woman who had deliberately concealed her fortune to find someone who would love her for exactly who she was rather than what she possessed. The irony was staggering. My son and his new family had spent months treating Celine like trash because they assumed she was poor and powerless. They had mocked her publicly, recorded their mockery, laughed at their own clever cruelty, and she had let them. had watched and waited and said nothing while they revealed exactly who they really were. "Elias," her voice came from the other room, calm but focused. "Would you come here for a moment?" I walked over and stood behind her chair, looking at the laptop screen. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Documents were arranged in overlapping windows: contracts, financial statements, corporate structures with boxes and lines connecting various entities. The numbers on these documents were enormous. Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. "What am I looking at?" "The cross-family business," she said matter-of-factly. "Ronan's development company, the enterprise that has funded their lifestyle for the past 30 years. I leaned closer, studying the figures. Even with my limited understanding of their specific industry, I could see the warning signs. Outstanding loans that dwarfed reported revenues, credit lines extended to precarious lengths, projects that were hemorrhaging cash faster than they could generate returns. "They are in serious trouble," I said. "Far more than trouble. They are perhaps 72 hours from a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The only thing keeping them from complete collapse is a consortium of lenders who have collectively agreed to extend their credit terms." She pulled up another screen. "A consortium that, as of 6 months ago, happens to have a new majority stakeholder." I looked at the name on the document. It was one of Celine's holding companies, a subsidiary of a subsidiary, buried under layers of corporate structure that would take forensic accountants months to untangle. "You control their loans," I said slowly. "I control many things," she replied. "This particular piece fell into place almost accidentally, part of a larger portfolio acquisition my advisors recommended last winter. I did not know at the time that the Cross family was one of the debtors involved, but once I discovered the connection..." She turned to look at me. "Well, I filed the information away for possible future use. And now? Now Ronan Cross spent an evening publicly insulting your wife. His daughter called me trash in front of 300 witnesses. They recorded their contempt, and no doubt shared it with everyone they know." Her voice remained perfectly calm, but underneath it I could hear something harder, something cold and unyielding as steel. "I do not tolerate that kind of treatment, Elias, not from anyone. What exactly are you planning to do?" "Nothing illegal, nothing even particularly aggressive. I am simply going to stop extending courtesies." She turned back to the screen and began typing again. "Credit lines can be reviewed, payment terms can be renegotiated, loans can be called in for any number of perfectly legitimate reasons, and once the financial press catches wind that the Cross family's primary lender is tightening conditions." She smiled slightly. "The rest tends to take care of itself." I thought about Ronan's face in the ballroom, his absolute certainty that he was untouchable, his complete confidence that his wealth and connections made him immune to consequence. "He has no idea what is about to happen," I said. "No, and that is precisely the point." Celine closed the laptop and stood up, stretching muscles that had been tensed for hours. "Real power does not announce itself, Elias. It does not make speeches or issue threats or demand respect. It simply arranges things, quietly, efficiently, and by the time anyone realizes what has happened, the outcome is already determined." She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me. I held her in return, feeling the warmth of her body against mine, smelling the subtle floral scent of her perfume. "What about Asher?" I asked after a while. "What happens to my son in all of this?" She pulled back slightly and looked at me with those remarkable gray-green eyes. "That depends entirely on Asher," she said. "He is your son, Elias, not my enemy. But if he continues to align himself with people who wish us harm, if he continues to choose their approval over your well-being..." She left the sentence unfinished, allowing me to supply my own ending. I nodded slowly. "I understand." "I hope so." She kissed me gently. "Because what comes next will test both of us. Your son may lose everything he thought he had. His in-laws will certainly suffer significant consequences. And people will wonder, speculate, whether you orchestrated the whole thing." "Did I?" She smiled that quiet, knowing smile that had first drawn me to her. "No, you just had the excellent judgment to marry the right woman." 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of quietly devastating change. Ronan Cross's primary lender requested immediate compliance review of all outstanding credit terms. His largest development project was flagged for permit violations. 3 key investors withdrew without explanation. Business associates who had returned his calls for decades suddenly became impossible to reach. The final meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon in the conference room of a law firm on the 42nd floor. I sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, Celine beside me in a charcoal suit, her attorneys surrounding us like a silent army. And across the table sat Ronan Cross, gray-faced, trembling, looking like a man who had aged 2 decades in 3 weeks. "You are offering to purchase my company," he said, his voice hoarse. "What remains of it?" Celine replied. "At fair market value. And if I refuse? Then your creditors proceed with liquidation, your assets are sold at auction, your family loses everything." She folded her hands on the table. "This offer is your best option. Take it." Ronan turned and looked at me. Really looked at me. "You did this," he said. "You and this woman." "Choose your next words carefully," I said. Something in him collapsed. "She fooled all of us, pretended to be nothing, and now she is taking everything. She is acquiring assets you were losing anyway. She is simply controlling the terms." "And that satisfies you?" I thought about the wedding, the toasts, the laughter, the phones recording my humiliation. "Yes," I said. "It does." Ronan signed the documents mechanically. When he finished, he stood and walked toward the door. "Ronan," he stopped. "At the wedding, you told me my wife would leave me with nothing. You said, 'for now.'" I walked toward him slowly. "Well, now I am finished. And so are you." Ronan Cross disappeared into the hallway. I smiled. The end!